Chapter 3. Anderson and Aguinaldo. Well, honor is the subject of my story. Julius Caesar, Act 1, Scene 2. The destruction of the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay on May 1, 1898, 10 days after the outbreak of the war with Spain, having necessitated sending troops to the Philippines to complete the reduction of the Spanish power in that quarter. Major General Wesley Merritt was on May 16 selected to organize and command such an expedition. The first expedition, as it was always distinguished by the officers and men of the 8th Army Corps, there having been many subsequent expeditions sent out before our war with the Filipinos was over, was itself subdivided into a number of different expeditions, troops being hurried to Manila as fast as they could be assembled and properly equipped in sufficient numbers. The first batch that were whipped into shape left San Francisco under command of Brigadier-General Thomas M. Anderson on May 25 and arrived off Manila, June 30. General Merritt did not arrive until July 25. It was General Anderson, therefore, who broke the ice of the American occupation of the Philippines. In his annual message to Congress of December, following, one summing up the war with Spain and its results, Mr. McKinley gives a brief account of the first expedition. After recounting Admiral Dewey's victory of May 1 previous, he states that on the 7th day of May the government was advised officially of the victory at Manila, and at once inquired of the commander of the fleet what troops would be required. President McKinley does not give the admiral's answer, though he does state that it was received on the 15th day of May. The admiral's answer appears, however, in the report of the Navy Department for 1898, Appendix, page 98. It was, in my best judgment, a well-equipped force of 5,000 men. But the President's message does state that he at once sent a total force consisting of 641 officers and 15,058 enlisted men. The difference of viewpoint of the Admiral and the President is clear from the language of both. In recommending 5,000 troops, the Admiral had said they would be necessary to retain possession of Manila, and thus control Philippine Islands. This counted, of course, on the friendship of the people, as in Cuba. I had in view simply taking possession of the city, said Admiral Dewey to the Senate Committee in 1902. The purpose of the President in sending 3 times as many troops as were needed for the purpose Admiral Dewey had in mind is indicated in his account of what happened. After describing the taking of Manila by our troops on August 13, the presidential message says, "By this the conquest of the Philippine Islands, virtually accomplished when the Spanish capacity for resistance was destroyed by Admiral Dewey's victory of May 1, was formally sealed." Admiral Dewey contemplated that we should merely remain masters of the situation out where he was until the end of the war. President McKinley set about to effect the conquest of the Philippine Islands. The naval victory of Manila Bay having made it certain that at the conclusion of our war against a decadent monarchy we would at last have an adequate coaling station and naval base in the Far East, the sending of troops to the Philippines, in appropriate prosecution of the war, to reduce and capture Manila, the capital and chief port, raised the question at once, and then what? The genesis of the idea of taking over the archipelago is traceable to within a few days after the destruction of the Spanish fleet. Within a few days after the official news of the Battle of Manila Bay reached Washington, the Treasury Department set a man to work making a report on financial and industrial conditions of the Philippine Islands. The Interior Department also awoke, about the same time, to possibilities of an El Dorado in the new overseas conquest. In May 1898, says Secretary of the Interior, C.N. Bliss, in a letter intended for the peace commissioners who met at Paris that fall, by arrangement between the Secretary of War with this department, Mr. Bliss's grammar is bad, but his meaning is plain. A geologist of the United States Geological Survey accompanied the military expedition to the Philippines for the purpose of procuring information touching the geological and mineral resources of said islands. This report, which accompanies the Bliss letter, reads like a mining stock prospectus. That summer an assistant secretary of the Treasury, presumably echoing the sentiments of the administration, came out in one of the great magazines of the period, The Century, with an article in which he said, "We see with sudden clearness that some of the most revered of our political maxims have outlived their force. A new mainspring has become the directing force, the mainspring of commercialism." Of course, the writer did not mention that Manila is an out-of-the-way place, so far as regards the main traveled routes across the Pacific Ocean, and also forgot that, as has been suggested once before, the carrying trade of the world, and the shippers on which it depends, in the contest of the nations for the markets of Asia, would never take to the practice of unloading at Manila by way of rehearsal, before finally discharging cargo on the mainland of Asia, where the name of the ultimate consumer is legion. Nevertheless, expansion of trade, mainly, was the slogan of the hour, and anyone who did not catch the contagion of exuberant allusion to our new possessions was considered crusty and out of date. People who referred back to the political maxims of Washington's farewell address, and the cognate set represented by the Monroe Doctrine, were regarded merely as not knowing a good thing when they saw it. So on rode the country, on the crest of the wave of war. When President McKinley sent the troops to the Philippines, their job was to hurry up and effect what his subsequent message to Congress describing their work called the conquest of the Philippine Islands. That is, they were to effect a constructive conquest of the archipelago before Spain should sue for peace. It never seemed to occur to anybody at home that the Filipinos would object. If the country had, through some divine interposition, gotten it into its head that the Filipinos were quite a decent lot and really did object very bitterly, it would have risen in its wrath and smitten down any suggestion of forcing a government on them against their will. But nobody knew anything about them. They were a wholly new proposition. General Anderson was of course furnished with a copy of the President's instructions to his chief, General Merritt. They are quite long, and go into details about a number of administrative matters that would necessarily come up after the city should surrender, such as the raising of revenue, the military commander's duty under the law of nations with regard to the seizure of transportation lines by land or sea, the protection of places of worship from desecration or destruction, and the like. The only portion of them that is essential to a clear understanding of subsequent events is now submitted. They are dated Executive Mansion, May 18, 1898, and read in part. President McKinley's instructions to General Merritt. The destruction of the Spanish fleet at Manila, followed by the taking of the naval station at Cavite, the paroling of the garrisons, and acquisition of control of the bay, have rendered it necessary, in the further prosecution of the measures adopted by this government for the purpose of bringing about an honorable and durable peace with Spain, to send an army of occupation to the Philippines for the twofold purpose of completing the reduction of the Spanish power in that quarter, and of giving order and security to the islands while in the possession of the United States. For the command of this expedition I have designated Major General Wesley Merritt, and it now becomes my duty to give instructions as to the manner in which the movements shall be conducted. The first effect of the military occupation of the enemy's territory is the severance of the former political relations of the inhabitants and the establishment of a new political power. Under this changed condition of things, the inhabitants, so long as they perform their duties, are entitled to security in their persons and property and in all their private rights and relations. It is my desire that the people of the Philippines should be acquainted with the purpose of the United States to discharge to the fullest extent its obligations in this regard. It will therefore be the duty of the commander of the expedition, immediately upon his arrival in the islands, to publish a proclamation declaring that we come not to make war upon the people of the Philippines nor upon any party or faction among them, but to protect them in their homes, in their employments, and in their personal and religious rights. All persons who, either by active aid or by honest submission, cooperate with the United States in its efforts to give effect to this beneficent purpose will receive the reward of its support and protection. Our occupation should be as free from severity as possible. Though the powers of the military occupant are absolute and supreme and operate immediately upon the political condition of the inhabitants, the municipal laws of the conquered territory, such as affect private rights of persons and property and provide for the punishment of crime, are to be considered as continuing in force, so far as they are compatible with the new order of things, until they are suspended or superseded by the occupying belligerents, and in practice they are not usually abrogated, but are allowed to remain in force and to be administered by the ordinary tribunals substantially as they were before the occupation. This enlightened practice is, so far as possible, to be adhered to on the present occasion. The freedom of the people to pursue their accustomed occupations will be abridged only when it may be necessary to do so. While the rule of conduct of the American commander-in-chief will be such as has just been defined, it will be his duty to adopt measures of a different kind if, unfortunately, the course of the people should render such measures indispensable to the maintenance of law and order. He will then possess the power to replace or expel the native officials in part or altogether, to substitute new courts of his own constitution for those that now exist, or to create such supplementary tribunals as may be necessary. In the exercise of these high powers the commander must be guided by his judgment and experience in a high sense of justice. While this document declares the purpose of our government to be a twofold purpose, viz. First, to make an appropriate move in the game of war, and, second, to police the islands, while in the possession of the United States, it is wholly free from inherent evidence of any intention out of harmony with the policy as to Cuba. In fact, when the city of Santiago de Cuba surrendered to our forces in July thereafter, and it became necessary to issue instructions for the guidance of the military commander there. Exactly the same instructions were given him, verbatim et literatum. But in respect of the Cuban instructions, there was never any concealment practiced or necessary, because the Cubans had been assured by the Teller Amendment to the resolutions declaring war against Spain that we had no ulterior designs on their country, and that, as soon as peace and public order were restored, we intended to leave the government and control of the island to its people. The Cuban instructions were therefore frankly and promptly published in General Orders No. 101 by the War Department, July 18, 1898, 5 days after they were received from the President, and were then translated into Spanish and spread broadcast over Santiago province without unnecessary delay. I remember poring over a Spanish copy of General Orders 101 at Santiago de Cuba, shortly after the fall of that city, which copy was one of many already posted about that city by direction of General Wood. The words, "The powers of the military occupant are absolute and supreme and operate immediately upon the political condition of the inhabitants," never disturbed the Cuban leaders in the least, because they were read in the light of the disclaimer contained in the declaration of war. On the other hand, the proclamation which the military commander in the Philippines was enjoined by his instructions to publish, immediately upon his arrival in the islands, which arrival occurred July 25, was not published until after we had taken Manila, August 13th, and then it copied only the glittering generalities of the instructions themselves, such as the part assuring the people that we had not come to make war on them and that vested rights would be respected, but it carefully omitted the words about the powers of the military occupant being absolute and supreme, because when the army arrived it found a native government that had already issued its Declaration of Independence, was making wonderful progress against the common enemy, and was able to put up a right good fight against us also, in case we should deny them independence. General Anderson arrived in Manila Bay, June 30, 1898, with about 2,500 men, and when General Merritt arrived, July 25, we had about 10,000 all told, while the Filipinos had half again that many, and there were 12,000 Spanish soldiers in Manila. General Anderson had not been long camped on the bayshore, under cover of the Navy's guns and in the neighborhood of Aguinaldo's headquarters, before he understood the whole situation clearly and wrote the War Department as follows. Since reading the President's instructions to General Merritt, I think I should state to you that the establishment of a provisional government on our part will probably bring us in conflict with insurgents. This letter is dated July 18, 1898. When General Anderson arrived in the islands on June 30, the Washington government was still wrestling with the angel of its announced creed about forcible annexation, being criminal aggression, and Mr. McKinley had to get both that angel's shoulders on the mat and put him out of business before he could get his own consent to giving any instructions to his generals which might sanction their killing people for objecting to forcible annexation. Hence his early anxiety to avoid a rupture with the Filipino leaders. The first stage of this wrestling coincides in point of time with General Anderson's tenure as the ranking military officer commanding our forces in the Philippines, which was from June 30 until the date of General Merritt's arrival, July 25. As already made plain, the President's instructions for the guidance of the military commander were entirely free from any land-grabbing suggestion. On the other hand, when General Anderson left San Francisco for Manila, May 25, there was already talk in the United States about retaining the islands, if they were captured, for he so informed Admiral Dewey in the first interview they had after the transports which brought his command cast anchor near our squadron in Manila Bay on the last day of June. "I was the first to tell Admiral Dewey," says he, in the North American Review for February, 1900, that there was any disposition on the part of the American people to hold the Philippines, if they were captured. The current opinion was setting that way when the expeditionary force left San Francisco, but this the Admiral had no reason to surmise. Relegated by the circumstances to his own discretion as to how he should act until Washington knew its mind, General Anderson's attitude in the outset represented a peace at any price policy, suffused with benevolent pride at championing the cause of the oppressed, but secretly knowing from the beginning that it might become necessary later to slaughter said oppressed, should they seriously object to a change of masters. On July 1, says General Anderson, Indiana, the North American Review article above quoted, I called on Aguinaldo with Admiral Dewey. Of the Admiral's dealings with the insurgent chief prior to this time, the General says in this same article, whether Admiral Dewey and Consuls Pratt, Wildman, and Williams did or did not give Aguinaldo assurances that a Filipino government would be recognized, the Filipinos certainly thought so, probably inferring this from their acts rather than from their statements. This last quoted passage was read to Admiral Dewey by a member of the Senate Committee in 1902, along with other parts of the magazine article cited, and he was asked to comment on the same. He said, "These are General Anderson's statements. They are very interesting, indeed. I am here to make my own statements." He had stated that he never did specifically promise Aguinaldo independence, and the questioner was trying to show that his acts had amounted to assurances and therefore had committed the government to giving the Filipinos their independence. Then Senator Patterson began another question, and had gotten as far as, "I want to know whether your views," when out came this, as of a sailor man clearing decks for action. "I do not like your questions a bit. I did not like them yesterday and I do not like them today." So the admiral's feelings were respected and the question was not pressed. There is no doubt at all that in the Philippines in the summer of 1898 the army turned the back of its hand to Aguinaldo as soon as it got there and baldly repudiated what the navy had done in the way of befriending the Filipinos. But both had acted under the authority of the commander-in-chief of the army and navy, the president. The admiral's sensitiveness on the subject ought to have been respected. And it was. By the time Admiral Dewey and General Anderson decided to call on Don Emilio, the day after the general's arrival, the unexpected intimations which the latter brought, as to the Washington program for the Philippine revolutionists being different from that as to Cuba, had begun to get in its work on the former. Not being a politician, the gallant admiral was there ready and able to carry out any orders his government might send him, whenever the politicians should decide what they wanted to do. But in the absence of orders, he began to trim his sails a bit, so as to be prepared for whatever might be the policy. Accordingly, before he and the general started out to pay their call on Don Emilio Aguinaldo y Fami, President of the Revolutionary Government of the Philippines and General-in-Chief of its army, as he had styled himself in his proclamation of June 23 the admiral said, "Do not take your sword or put on your uniform, but just put on your blouse. Do not go with any ceremony." And says he, in telling this, "We went in that way." The reason of thus avoiding too much ceremony toward our ally, claiming to represent an existing government which had lately declared its independence, is explained by an expression of the admiral's concerning said declaration of independence itself. "That was my idea, not taking it seriously." At that same hearing, the admiral explained with much genuine feeling that from the day of the naval battle of May 1 until the arrival of the army, these great questions were coming up constantly and he simply met them as they arose by acting on his best judgment on the spot at the time. But what a terrible mistake it was not to take that Declaration of Independence of June 23 seriously, backed as it was by an army of 15,000 men flushed with victory, and under the absolute control of the author of the Declaration. Of course the Declaration had been published to the army. Could its author have checked them by repudiating it even if he had wanted to? As Aguinaldo himself expressed what would happen in such a contingency, they would fail to recognize me as the interpreter of their aspirations and would punish me as a traitor, replacing me by another more careful of his own honor and dignity. This Dewey Anderson call on Aguinaldo was on July 1. Admiral Dewey now began to foresee that, 58, the Washington program was going to put him in an awkward position. So he began to take Aguinaldo more seriously. On July 4, he wired Washington. Aguinaldo proclaimed himself President of the Revolutionary Republic on July 1. It was on July 7 that Admiral Dewey captured 1,300 armed Spanish prisoners, the garrison of Isla La Grande, off Olongapo, and turned them over to the forces of the Aguinaldo government because he had no way to keep them. Was not that taking that government a bit seriously? How wholly unauthorized by the facts was this of not taking it seriously, on the part of the liberator of the Filipinos, the immortal victor of Manila Bay, who 2 months before had taught the nation the magnitude of its power for good, in a cause as righteous as the Crusades of old, and more sensible. But to return to General Anderson's account in the North American Review of his call, with Admiral Dewey, on the insurgent chief. He asked me at once whether the United States of the North either had, or would recognize his government. I am not quite sure as to the form of the question, whether it was, had, or, would. In either form it was embarrassing. General Anderson then tells of Aguinaldo's returning his call. A few days thereafter he made an official call, coming with cabinet, staff, and band. He asked if we, the North Americans, as he called us, intended to hold the Philippines as dependencies. I said I could not answer that, but that in 122 years we had established no colonies. He then made this remarkable statement. I have studied attentively the Constitution of the United States, and I find in it no authority for colonies, and I have no fear. General Anderson adds, it may seem that my answer was evasive, but I was at the time trying to contract with the Filipinos for horses, fuel, and forage. While this history must not lapse into an almanac, it may not be amiss to follow these early stages of this matter through a few more successive dates, because the history of that period was all indelibly branded into Filipino memory shortly afterward with the red-hot iron of war. July 4th, General Anderson writes the Filipino candidate for independence inviting him to cooperate with us in military operations against the Spanish forces. This was written not to arrange any plan of cooperation but in order to get room about Cavite as a military base without a row. In his North American Review article, General Anderson says that on that same day, the 4th of July, Aguinaldo was invited to witness a parade and review in honor of our national holiday. He did not come, says the article, because he was not invited as president but as General Aguinaldo. An odd situation, was it not? Here was a man claiming to be president of a newly established republic based on the principles set forth in our Declaration of Independence, which republic had just issued a like declaration, and he was invited to come and hear our declaration read, and declined because we would not recognize his right to assert the same truths. On subsequent anniversaries of the day in the Philippines, it was deemed wise simply to prohibit the reading of our declaration before gatherings of the Filipino people. It saved discussion. July 6th, General Anderson writes telling Aguinaldo that he is expecting more troops soon and therefore, I would like to have your Excellency's advice and cooperation. July 9th, General Anderson writes the War Department that Aguinaldo tells him he has about 15,000 fighting men, 11,000 armed with guns, and some 4,000 prisoners, and adds, when we first landed he seemed very suspicious, and not at all friendly, but I have now come to a better understanding with him and he is much more friendly and seems willing to cooperate. July 13th, we find Admiral Dewey also still in a cooperative mood. On that day he cables the Navy Department of the capture of the 1,300 prisoners on July 7th, mentioned above, which capture was made, it appears, because Aguinaldo complained to him that a German warship was interfering with his operations, the prisoners being at once turned over to Aguinaldo, as stated above. July 18th is the date of the letter to the War Department in which General Anderson states that the establishment of a provisional government by us will probably mean a conflict with the insurgents. This was equivalent to saying that they will probably be ready to fight whenever we assert the absolute and supreme authority that the President's instructions had directed to be asserted by the Army as soon as it should arrive in the Philippines. Yet in the fall of 1899, President McKinley said he never dreamed that Aguinaldo's little band would oppose our rule to the extent of war against it. It would have been more accurate if the martyred Christian gentleman who used those words had said he always hoped they would not, instead of never dreamed they would. This letter of July 18th informs the department, Aguinaldo has declared himself dictator and self-appointed president. He has declared martial law and promulgated a minute method of procedure under it. July 19th, General Anderson sends now Major General, J.F. Bell, to Aguinaldo, and asks of him a number of favors, such as any soldier may properly ask of an ally, for example, permission to see his military maps, etc., and that Aguinaldo place at his, Bell's, disposal any information you may have on the above subjects, and also give him, Bell, a letter or pass addressed to your subordinates which will authorize them to furnish him any information they can and to facilitate his passage along the lines, upon a reconnaissance around Manila, on which I propose to send him. All of which Aguinaldo did. Military training is very keen on honor. Talk about what the French call foi d'officier, the word of an officer. Did ever a letter from one soldier to another more completely commit the faith and honor of his government to recognition of the existence of an alliance? In 122 years we have established no colonies, he had told Aguinaldo. It looks like we are about to go into the colonizing business, he had, in effect, said to Admiral Dewey, about the same time. July 21st, General Anderson writes the Adjutant General of the Army as follows, since I last wrote, Aguinaldo has put in operation an elaborate system of military government. It may seem strange that I have made no formal protest against his proclamation as dictator, his declaration of martial law, etc. I wrote such a protest but did not publish it at Admiral Dewey's request. When he wrote this letter, General Anderson was evidently beginning to have some compunctions about the trouble he now saw ahead. He was a veteran of the Civil War, whose gallantry had then been proven on many a field against an enemy compared with whom these people would be a picnic. But things did not look to the grim old hero like there was going to be a square deal. So he put this in the letter, I submit, with all deference, that we have heretofore underrated the natives. They are not ignorant savage tribes, but have a civilization of their own, and although insignificant in appearance are fierce fighters, and for a tropical people they are industrious. A small detail of natives will do more work than a regiment of volunteers. Of course, this slam at volunteers was a bit rough. But the battle-scarred veteran's sense of fair play was getting on his nerves. He foresaw the coming conflict, and though he did not shirk it, he did not relish it. He understood the game, and it seemed to him the cards were stacked, to meet the necessity of demonstrating that forcible annexation, instead of being criminal aggression, was merely trade expansion, and that his government was right then irrevocably committing itself, without any knowledge of, or acquaintance with, the Filipinos, to the assumption that they were incapable of running a government of their own. The next day, July 22d, General Anderson wrote Aguinaldo a letter advising him that he was without orders as yet concerning the question of recognizing his government. But that this letter was neither a protest nor in the nature of a protest, is evident from its text. I observe that your excellency has announced yourself dictator and proclaimed martial law. As I am here simply in a military capacity, I have no authority to recognize such an assumption. I have no orders from my government on the subject. Yet General Anderson's letter to the Adjutant General of the Army of July 18, 23 uses the words, since reading the President's instructions to General Merrit, etc., showing that he had a copy of them, and those instructions order and direct, see ante, that as soon as the commanding general of the American troops arrives he is to let the Filipinos know that the powers of the military occupant are absolute and supreme and immediately operate upon the political condition of the inhabitants. A charitable view of the matter would be that, technically, those were Merritt's orders, not Anderson's. But the whole scheme was to conceal the intention to assume supreme authority and keep Aguinaldo quiet, until, as General Merritt afterwards expressed it in his report, I should be in possession of the city of Manila, as I would not until then be in a position to enforce my authority, in the event that his, Aguinaldo's, pretensions should clash with my designs. The same day that General Anderson wrote Aguinaldo his billet doux about the dictatorship, viz. July 22d, he cabled Washington a much franker and more serious message, which read, Aguinaldo declares dictatorship and martial law over all islands. The people expect independence. The very next day, July 23d, he wrote Aguinaldo asking his assistance in getting 500 horses, and 50 oxen and ox carts, and manifesting considerable impatience that he had not already complied with a similar request previously made, as it was to fight in the cause of your people. The following day, July 24th, replying to General Anderson's letter of the 22d wherein General Anderson had advised him that he was as yet without orders concerning the question of recognizing his government, Aguinaldo wrote, It is true that my government has not been acknowledged by any of the foreign powers, but we expected that the great North American nation, which had struggled first for its independence, and afterwards for the abolition of slavery, and is now actually struggling for the independence of Cuba, would look upon it with greater benevolence than any other nation. That cablegram of July 22d, above quoted, in which the commanding general of our forces in the Philippines advises the Washington government, the people expect independence, is the hardest thing in the published archives of our government covering that momentous period for those who love the memory of Mr. McKinley to get around. After the war with the Filipinos broke out, Mr. McKinley said repeatedly in public speeches, I never dreamed they would turn against us. You do not find the Anderson cablegram of July 22d in the published report of the War Department covering the period under consideration. General Anderson addressed it to the Secretary of War and signed it, and, probably for lack of Army cable facilities, got Admiral Dewey to send it to the Secretary of the Navy for transmission to the Secretary of War. Certain it must be that at some cabinet meeting on or after July 22, 1898, either the Secretary of the Navy or the Secretary of War read in the hearing of the President and the rest of his advisers that message from General Anderson, the people expect independence. The object here is not to inveigh against Mr. McKinley. It is to show that, as Gibbon told us long ago, in speaking of the discontent of far distant possessions and the lack of hold of the possessor on the affections of the inhabitants thereof, the cry of remote distress is ever faintly heard. The average American today, if told the Filipinos want independence, will give the statement about the same consideration Mr. McKinley did then, and if told that the desire among them for a government of their people by their people for their people has not been diminished since the late war by tariff taxation without representation, and the steady development of race prejudice between the dominant alien race and the subject one, he will begin to realize by personal experience how faintly the uttered longings of a whole people may fall on distant ears. We saw above that in a letter written July 21st, the day before the telegram about the people expect independence, which letter must have reached Washington within 30 days, General Anderson not only notified Washington all about Aguinaldo's government and its pretensions, but stated that at the request of Admiral Dewey he had made no protest against it. Yet straight on through the period of General Merritt's sojourn in the islands, which began July 25 and terminated August 29, we find no protest ordered by Washington, and we further find the purpose of the President as announced in the instructions to Merritt. The powers of the military occupant are absolute and supreme throughout the islands, not only not communicated to the Filipino people, but deliberately suppressed from the proclamation published by General Merritt pursuant to those instructions. Comments and conclusions are usually impertinent and unwelcome save as mere addenda to facts, but in the light of the facts derivable from our own official records, is it any wonder that General Anderson, a gallant veteran of the Civil War, and perhaps the most conspicuous figure of the early fighting in the Philippines, delivered an address some time after he came back home before the Oregon Commandery of the Loyal Legion of the United States on the subject, should republics have colonies? And answered the question emphatically, no. Chapter 4. Merritt and Aguinaldo. There are no tricks in plain and simple faith. Julius Caesar, Act 4, Scene 2. Major General Wesley Merritt's account of the operations of the troops under his command in the first expedition to the Philippines may be found in Volume I. Part 2, War Department Report for 1898. He left San Francisco accompanied by his staff, June 29, 1898, arrived at Cavite, Manila Bay, July 25, received the surrender of the city of Manila August 13, and sailed thence August 30, in obedience to orders from Washington to proceed without unnecessary delay to Paris, France, for conference with the peace commissioners. According to General Merritt's report, about the time he arrived Aguinaldo had some 12,000 men under arms, with plenty of ammunition, and a number of field pieces. The late lamented Frank D. Millet has preserved for us, in his expedition to the Philippines, some valuable and intimate studies of this army of Filipino besiegers whom our troops found busily at work when they arrived in the islands. It was an interesting sight at Camp Dewey to see the insurgents strolling to and from the front. Pretty much all day long they were coming and going, never in military formation, but singly, and in small groups, perfectly clean and tidy in dress, often accompanied by their wives and children, and all chatting as merrily as if they were going off on a pigeon shoot. The men who sold fish and vegetables in camp in the morning would be seen every day or two dressed in holiday garments, with rifle and cartridge boxes, strolling off to take their turn at the Spaniards. The reader will readily understand that there were many times as many volunteers as guns. Mr. Millet continues, when they had been at the front 24 hours they were relieved and returned home for a rest. They generally passed their rifles and equipments on to another man, and thus a limited number of weapons served to arm a great many besiegers. They had no distinctive uniform, the only badge of service being a red and blue cockade with a white triangle bearing the Malay symbol of the sun and 3 stars, and sometimes a red and blue band pinned diagonally across the lower part of the left sleeve. Many of them had belonged to the native volunteer force. The recruits were soon hammered into shape by the veterans of the rank and file. Their men were perfectly obedient to orders and they made the most devoted soldiers. There was no visible commissary or quartermaster's departments, but the insurgent force was always supplied with food and ammunition and there was no lack of transportation. The food issued at the front was mostly rice brought up in caramadas to within a few hundred yards of the trenches, when it was cooked by the women. Each man had a double handful of rice, sometimes enriched by a small proportion of meat and fish, which was served him in a square of plantain leaf. Thus he was unencumbered with a plate or knife or fork and threw away his primitive but excellent dish when he had licked the platter clean. It was noticeable that the insurgents carried no water bottles nor haversacks, and no equipments indeed, but cartridge boxes. They did not seem to be worried by thirst like our men. Although insignificant in appearance, they are fierce fighters, wrote General Anderson to the Adjutant General of the Army in July. General Merritt states in his report that Aguinaldo had proclaimed an independent government, republican in form, with himself as president, and at the time of my arrival in the islands the entire edifice of executive and legislative departments had been accomplished, at least on paper. Of course at that time we were still officially declining to take Filipino aspirations for independence seriously, and preferred to treat Aguinaldo's government as purely a matter of stationery. As a matter of fact, an exhaustive examination of the official documents of that period, made with a view of ascertaining just how much of that Aguinaldo government of 1898 was stationary fiction and how much was stable fact, has absolutely surprised one man who was out there from 1899 to 1905. The writer, and I have no doubt will be interesting, as mere matter of political necrology, to any American who was there in the days of the Empire, as the 99ers called it. Early in the spring of 1899, Mr. McKinley sent out the commission of which President Sherman of Cornell University was chairman, to try to stop the war. They bent themselves to the task in a spirit as kindly as that in which we know Mr. McKinley himself would have acted. They failed because the war was already on and the Filipinos were bent on fighting for independence to the bitter end. But they learned a good deal about the facts of the earlier situation. Speaking of these in their report to the President with a special reference to the period beginning with Aguinaldo's landing at Cavite in May, after describing how the Filipino successes in battle with the Spaniards finally resulted in all of them being driven into Manila, where they remained hemmed in, they say, while the Spanish troops now remained quietly in Manila, the Filipino forces made themselves masters of the entire island except that city. For 3½ months, says General Otis in describing the facts of this same situation a year later, the insurgents on land had kept Manila tightly bottled, meaning while Admiral Dewey had been blockading the place by water, and food supplies were exhausted. We had Manila and Cavite. The rest of the island was held not by the Spanish but by the Filipinos, said General Anderson Indiana the North American Review for February 1900. It is a fact that they were in possession. They had gotten pretty much the whole thing except Manila, said Admiral Dewey to the Senate Committee in 1902. General Merritt took Manila August 13th, and sailed away for Paris August 31st, and only a week after that General Otis wired Washington, under date of September 7th, from Manila. Insurgents have captured all Spanish garrisons in island of Luzon, and control affairs outside of Cavite in this city. The recruiting by Aguinaldo of an army of 40,000 men with guns within 100 days after his little return from Elba, 15,000 fighting men, 11,000 of them armed with guns, in 50 days, which number had swelled to nearly 40,000 men with guns in another 50 days, by August 29th, is no more remarkable than his progress in organizing his government and making its grip on the whole island of Luzon effective in a short space of time. As all Americans who know the Filipinos know how fond they are of what government offices call paperwork, and how their escribientes 9 can work like bees in drafting documents, it might be easy to ignore Aguinaldo's various proclamations, already hereinbefore noticed in Chapter 2, as representing merely a government on paper, were there no other proof. But among the insurgent captured papers we found long afterward, there is a document containing the minutes of a convention of the Insurrecto Presidentes from all the pueblos of 15 different provinces, on August 6, 1898, which throws a flood of light on the subject now under consideration. This convention was held at Bacoor, then Aguinaldo's headquarters, a little town on the bay shore between Manila and Cavite. The minutes of the convention recite that its members had been previously chosen as presidentes of their respective pueblos in the manner prescribed by previous decrees issued by Aguinaldo, already noticed, and that thereafter they had taken the oath of office before Aguinaldo as president of the government, etc. They then declare that the Filipino people whom they speak for are not ambitious for power, nor honors, nor riches, aside from their rational aspirations for a free and independent life, and proclaim solemnly, in the face of the whole world, the independence of the Philippines. They also reaffirm allegiance to Aguinaldo as president of the government and request him to seek recognition of it at the hands of the powers, because, says the paper, to no one is it permitted to stifle the legitimate aspirations of a people, as if Europe cared a rap what we did to them except in the way of regret that it did not have a finger in the pie. However, they were not only apprehensive, on the one hand, lest we might be tempted to take their country away from Spain for ourselves, but also, on the other hand, lest we might in the wind-up decide to leave them to Spain at the end of the war. That this last was not an idle fear is shown by the fact that during the deliberations of the Paris Peace Commission, Judge Gray urged, in behalf of his contention against taking the islands at all, that if Dewey had sunk the Spanish fleet off Cadiz, instead of in Manila Bay, and the Carlists had incidentally helped us about that time, we would have been under no resulting obligation to stay by them at the conclusion of the war. When the Presidentes in convention assembled as aforesaid got through with their whereases and resolutions, they presented them to His Excellency the President of the Republic, Aguinaldo, who then issued a proclamation which recited, among other things, in these provinces, the 15 represented in the convention, complete order and perfect tranquility reign, administered by the authorities elected, according to his previous decrees as dictator, which decrees have already been placed before the reader. The proclamation claims that the new government has 9,000 prisoners of war and 30,000 combatants. The former claim no one having any acquaintance with those times and conditions will question for a moment. As to the 30,000 combatants, if he had 11,000 men armed with guns on July 9th and 40,000 on August 29th, why not 30,000 on August 6th? Of course, men without guns, bolo men, do not count for much in a serious connection like this now being considered. In November 1899, at San Jose, in Nueva Ecija province, I heard General Lawton tell Colonel Jack Hayes to disarm and turn loose 175 bolo men the colonel had just captured and was lining up on the public square as we rode into the town. But we are considering how much of a government the Filipinos had in 1898, because the answer is pertinent to what sort of a government they could run if permitted now or at any time in the future. And, physical force being the ultimate basis of stability in all government, when we come to estimate how much of an army they had when their government was claiming recognition as a legitimate living thing, we must remember that it was just a question of arming them. They could have had the whole population. Now the great significant fact about this Bacoor Convention of Presidentes of August 6th, a week before Manila surrendered to our forces, is that in it more than half the population of the island of Luzon was represented. The total population of the Philippines is about 7,600,000, and, of these, one half, or 3,800,000 live on Luzon. The other islands may be said to dangle from Luzon like the tail of a kite. Taking the tables of the American Census of the Philippines of 1903, Volume E, page 123, as a basis on which to judge what Aguinaldo's claims of August 6th amounted to if true, the population of the provinces thus duly incorporated into the new government and in working order on that date, was, in round numbers, about as follows: south of Manila, Cavite, 135,000, Batangas, 260,000, Laguna, 150,000, Tayabas, 150,000, north of Manila, Bulacan, 225,000, Pampanga, 225,000, Nueva Ecija, 135,000, Tarlac, 135,000, Pangasinan, 400,000, Union, 140,000, Bataan, 45,000, Zambales, 105,000. This represents a total of more than 2 million of people. But Aguinaldo's claims of August 6th are not the only evidence as to the political status of the provinces of Luzon in August 1898. Toward the end of that month, Major J.F. Bell, chief of General Merritt's Bureau of Military Information, made a report on the situation as it stood August 29th, the report being made after most careful investigation, and intended as a summary of the then situation according to the most reliable information obtainable, in order that General Merritt might know, as far as practicable, what he would be up against in the event of trouble with the insurgents. This report not only corroborates Aguinaldo's claims of August 6th, but it also concedes to the Aguinaldo people 8 other important provinces, 4 south of the Pasig River with a total population of about 630,000, the only 4 of southern Luzon not included in Aguinaldo's claim of August 6th, thus conceding him practically all of Luzon south of the Pasig, and it furthermore concedes him 4 great provinces of northern Luzon with a total population of nearly 600,000. General Bell states that these last are still in the possession of the Spanish, but practically certain to be with the insurgents in the very near future. Insurgents have been dispatched to attack the Spanish in these provinces, says the Bell report. In this same report, Major Bell said, "There is not a particle of doubt but what Aguinaldo and his leaders will resist any attempt of any government to reorganize a colonial government here." When the insurgent government was finally dislodged from its last capital and Aguinaldo became a fugitive hotly pursued by our troops, he started for the mountains of northern Luzon, passing through provinces he had never visited before. The diary of one of his staff officers, Major Villa, in describing a brief stop they made in a town en route, Aringay, in Union Province, says, "After the Honorable President had urged them, the townspeople, to be patriotic, we continued the march." They certainly did continue the march. The Macabebe Scouts, of which the writer commanded a company at the time, took the town a few hours later, Aguinaldo's rear guard retiring after a brief resistance, following which we found, among the dead in the trenches, a major other than Villa. Certainly, to read this little extract from the diary of Aguinaldo's retreat is to feel the pulse of northern Luzon as to its loyalty to the revolution at that time, and is corroborative of these claims of Aguinaldo made in August 1898, supplemented, as we have seen them, by General Bell's appraisal. As to the political conditions which prevailed in southern Luzon, particularly in the Camarines, in August and the fall of 1898, information derived from one who was there then would seem appropriate here. Major Blanton Winship, Judge Advocates Corps, USA, Major Archibald W. Butt, the late lamented military aide to President Taft, and the writer, lived together in Manila, in 1900, at the house of a Spanish physician, a Dr. Lopez, who had been a prisoner at Nueva Caceres, a town situated in one of the provinces of southern Luzon, Camarines, in the fall of 1898. Dr. Lopez had a large family. They had also been prisoners down there. No evil befell them at the hands of their captors. They had the freedom of the town they were in. They had good reason to be pretty well scared as to what the insurgents might do to them. But they were never maltreated. The main impression we got from Dr. Lopez and his family was that the political grip of the Aguinaldo government on southern Luzon was complete during the time they were prisoners there. If anybody doubts the absoluteness of the grip of the revolutionary government on the situation in the provinces which were represented at the Bacoor Convention of August 6, 1898, above mentioned, when the Filipino Declaration of Independence was signed and proclaimed, let him ask any American who had a part in putting down the Philippine insurrection what a presidente, an insurrecto presidente, in a Filipino town, was in 1899 and 1900. He was the whole thing. Even today the presidente of a pueblo is as absolute boss of his town as Charles F. Murphy is of Tammany Hall. And a town or pueblo in the Philippines is more than an area covered by more or less contiguous buildings and grounds. It is more like a township in Massachusetts, so that when you account governmentally for the pueblos of a given province, you account for every square foot of that province and for every man in it. For several years before our war with Spain, nearly every Filipino of any education and spirit in the archipelago belonged to the secret revolutionary society known as the Katipunan. This had its organization in every town when Dewey sank the Spanish fleet and landed Aguinaldo at Cavite. The rest may be imagined. By September 1898, Aguinaldo was absolute master of the whole of Luzon. Before the Treaty of Paris was signed, December 10, 1898, in fact while Judge Gray of the Peace Commission was cabling President McKinley that not to leave the government of the Philippines to the people thereof, would be to make a mockery of instructions, Aguinaldo had become equally absolute master of the situation throughout the rest of the archipelago outside of Manila. Toward the end of July, 1898, our Manila consul, Mr. Williams, who was one of our consular triumvirate of would-be Warwicks, or original Aguinaldo men, of 1898, used to have nice talks with Aguinaldo about the lion and the lamb lying down together without the lion eating the lamb, and in one instance, at least, he goes so far as to represent Aguinaldo as willing to some such arrangement, e.g., annexation or some vague scheme of dependence. But whenever we hear from Aguinaldo over his own signature, we hear him saying whatever means in Tagalog, Tomeo Danaos et Dona Ferentes. For instance, at page 15 of Senate Document 208, he writes Williams, under date of August 1st, with fine courtesy, I congratulate you with all sincerity on the acuteness and ingenuity which you have displayed in painting in an admirable manner the benefits which, especially for me and my leaders, and in general for all my compatriots, would be secured by the union of these islands with the United States of America. Ah! That picture, so happy and so finished. This is not saying that I am not of your opinion. You say all this and yet more will result from annexing ourselves to your people. You are my friend and the friend of the Filipinos and have said it. But why should we say it? Will my people believe it? I have done what they desire, establishing a government not only because it was my duty, but also because had I acted in any other manner they would fail to recognize me as the interpreter of their aspirations, and would punish me as a traitor, replacing me by another more careful of his own honor and dignity. Now that we know what was in the Filipino mind when General Merritt arrived in the Philippines, let us see what was in the American military mind out there at the same time. Says General Merritt, General Aguinaldo did not visit me on my arrival nor offer his services as a subordinate leader. We trust the reason of this at once suggests itself from what has preceded, including General Anderson's dealings with the insurgent chief. The latter wanted some understanding as to what the intentions of our government were, and what was to be the program afterward, should he and his countrymen assist in the little fighting that now remained necessary to complete the taking of Manila. Those intentions were precisely what Merritt was determined to conceal. as my instructions from the President fully contemplated the occupation of the islands by the American land forces, and stated that the powers of the military occupant are absolute and supreme and immediately operate upon the political condition of the inhabitants, I did not consider it wise to hold any direct communication with the insurgent leader until I should be in possession of the city of Manila. On one occasion General Merrit passed through the village of Bacoor where Aguinaldo had his headquarters, but, says Mr. Millet in mentioning this, they never met. After the taking of the city, General Merrit remembered that with some 13,000 Spanish prisoners to guard, and a city of 300,000 people, all but a sprinkling of whom were in sympathy with the insurgent cause, on his hands, and an army of at least 14,000 insurgents, probably far more than that, clamoring without the gates of that city, and only 10,000 men of his own with whom to handle such a situation, frankness was out of the question, in view of his orders from the President. Therefore, on the day after the city surrendered, General Merrit issued a proclamation, copying verbatim from Mr. McKinley's instructions, ante, such innocuous milk and water passages is the one which assured the people that our government has not come to wage war upon them but to protect them in their homes, in their employments, and in their personal and religious rights. All persons who, by active aid or honest submission, cooperate with the United States will receive the reward of its support and protection. But he carefully omitted the words quoted above about the powers of the military occupant being absolute and supreme, lest his, Aguinaldo's, pretensions, to use General Merritt's expression, should clash with my designs. For these reasons, says General Merritt, the preparations for the attack on the city were conducted without reference to the situation of the insurgent forces. Here General Merritt is speaking frankly but not accurately. He means he made his preparations without any more reference to the situation of the insurgent forces than he could help. As a matter of fact, their situation bothered him a good deal. They were in the way. For instance, there was a whole brigade of them at one point between our people and Manila. This, says General Merritt, was overcome by instructions to General Greene to arrange if possible with the insurgent brigade commander in his immediate vicinity to move to the right and allow the American forces unobstructed control of the roads in their immediate front. No objection was made, etc. That reads very well. That about, arrange if possible, no objection was made, etc., does it not? Nothing there through which the luster and the moral strength of the motives that prompted the Spanish War might be dimmed by ulterior designs which might tempt us, is there? It was stated above that General Merritt was speaking frankly in this report. He was. He probably did not know how General Greene carried out the order to arrange if possible with the insurgent brigadier commander. But it so happened that there was a newspaper correspondent along with General Greene who has since told us. This gentleman was Mr. Frank D. Millet, from whom we have already above quoted, the correspondent of the London Times and of Harper's Weekly. General Greene had known him years before in the campaigns of the Turco-Russian War. Mr. Millet had been a war correspondent in those campaigns also, and General Greene was there taking observations. So that in the operations against Manila, Mr. Millet, being an old friend of General Greene's, known to be a handy man to have around in a close place, was acting as a civilian volunteer aide to the general. Here is Mr. Millet's account of what happened, taken from his book, The Expedition to the Philippines. On the afternoon of the 28th of July, 1898, General Greene received a verbal message from General Merritt suggesting that he juggle the insurgents out of part of their lines, always on his own responsibility, and without committing in any way the commanding general to any recognition of the native leaders or opening up the prospect of an alliance. This General Greene accomplished very cleverly. Mr. Millet then goes on to tell how General Greene persuaded one of Aguinaldo's generals, Noriel, to evacuate certain trenches so he, Greene, could occupy them, with a condition attached that General Greene must give a written receipt for the entrenchments. This condition, Mr. Millet says, was imposed by the astute leader, Aguinaldo. General Greene's cleverness consisted in purposely failing and omitting to give the receipt, which Mr. Millet says, looked very much like a bargain concluded over a signature, and was a little more formal than General Greene thought advisable. The key to this sorry business may be found in the first paragraph of General Merritt's instructions to all his generals at the time: no rupture with insurgents. This is imperative. Can ask insurgent generals or Aguinaldo for permission to occupy trenches, but if refused not to use force. I am quite unable to explain, says Mr. Millet, why we did not in the very beginning make them understand that we were masters of the situation, and that they must come strictly under our authority. The obvious reason was that a war of conquest to subjugate a remote people struggling to be free from the yoke of alien domination was sure to be more or less unpopular with many of the sovereign voters of a republic, and more or less dangerous therefore, like all unpopular wars, to the tenure of office of the party in power. So that in entering upon a war for conquest, a republic must play politics, using the military arm of the government for the twofold purpose of crushing opposition and proving that there is none. The maxim which makes all fair in war often covers a multitude of sins. But let us turn for a moment from strategy to principle, and see what two other distinguished American war correspondents were thinking and saying about the same time. Writing to Harper's Weekly from Cavite, under date of July 16, concerning the work of the Filipinos during the 8 weeks before that, Mr. O.K. Davis said, "The insurgents have driven them, the Spaniards, back over 20 miles of country practically impassable for our men. Aguinaldo has saved our troops a lot of desperately hard campaigning. The insurgent works extend clear around Manila, and the Spaniards are completely hemmed in. There is no hope for them but surrender." Writing to the same paper under date of August 6, Mr. John F. Bass says, "We forget that they drove the Spaniards from Cavite to their present entrenched position, thus saving us a long-continued fight through the jungle." This gentleman did not tackle the question of inventing a new definition of liberty consistent with alien domination. He simply says, "Give them their liberty and guarantee it to them." In the face of such plucky patriotism as he had witnessed, political casuistry about capacity for self-government would have hung its head. Yet Mr. Bass was by no means a novice. He had served with the British Army in Egypt in 1895, through the Armenian massacres of 1896, and in the Cretan Rebellion and Greek War of 1897. His sentiments were simply precisely what those of the average American not under military orders would have been at the time. After the fall of Manila he wrote, August 17, "I am inclined to think that the insurgents intend to fight us if we stay and Spain if we go." There were 8,500 American troops in the taking of the city of Manila on August 13, 1898. The Filipinos were ignored by them, although they afterwards claimed to have helped. As a matter of fact, the Spanish officers in command were very anxious to surrender and get back to Spain. The Filipinos had already made them long for peace, to use a famous expression of General J.F. Bell. The garrison only put up a very slight resistance, to save their face, as the Chinese say, to save themselves from being court-martialed under some quixotic article of the Spanish Army regulations. The assault was begun about 9:30 a.m., and early that afternoon the Spanish flag had been lowered from the flagstaff in the main square and the stars and stripes run up in its stead, amid the convulsive sobs of dark-eyed senoritas and the muttered curses of melodramatic Spanish cavaliers. Thanks to the Filipinos' 3½ months' work, the performance only cost us 5 men killed out of the 8,500. The list of wounded totaled 43. Our antecedent loss in the trenches prior to the day of the assault had been 14 killed and 60 wounded. So the job was completed, so far as the records show, at a cost of less than a score of American lives. As Aguinaldo's troops surged forward in the wake of the American advance, they were stopped by orders from the American commander, and prevented from following the retreating Spaniards into Manila. They were not even allowed what is known to the modern small boy as a look-in. They were not permitted to come into the city to see the surrender. President McKinley's message to Congress of December 1898 describes the last scene of the war as having been enacted at Manila, its starting place. It says, "On August 13th, after a brief assault upon the works by the land forces, in which the squadron assisted, the capital surrendered unconditionally." In this connection, by way of explaining Aguinaldo's treatment at the hands of our generals from the beginning, the message says, "Divided victory was not permissible. It was fitting that whatever was to be done should be accomplished by the strong arm of the United States alone." But what takes much of the virtue out of the strong arm proposition is that Generals Merritt and Anderson were carrying out President McKinley's orders all the time they were juggling Aguinaldo out of his positions before Manila, and giving him evasive answers, until the city could be taken by the said strong arm alone. For, as the message puts it, in speaking of the taking of the city, by this the conquest of the Philippine Islands was formally sealed. When General Merritt left Manila on August 30th, he proceeded to Paris to appear before the Peace Commission there. His views doubtless had great weight with them on the momentous questions they had to decide. But his views were wholly erroneous, and that they were so is not surprising. As above stated, he did not even meet Aguinaldo, purposely holding himself aloof from him and his leaders. He never did know how deeply they were incensed at being shut out of Manila when the city surrendered. In his report prepared aboard the steamship China, en route for Paris, he says, "Doubtless much dissatisfaction is felt by the rank and file of the insurgents, but I am of the opinion that the leaders will be able to prevent serious disturbances, etc." If General Merritt had caught the temper of the trenches, he would have known better, but he saw nothing of the fighting prior to the final scene, nor did he take the field in person on the day of the combined assault on the city, August 13th, and therefore missed the supreme opportunity to understand how the Filipinos felt. Says General Anderson in his report, "I understood from the general commanding that he would be personally present on the day of battle. On the morning of the 13th, General Babcock came to my headquarters and informed me that the Major General commanding would remain on a dispatch boat. Indeed, so reduced was Manila, by reason of the long siege conducted by the insurgents, that the assault of August 13th not only was, but was expected to be, little more than a sham battle." Says Lieutenant Colonel Pope, Chief Quartermaster, "On the evening of August 12th an order was sent me to report with 2 battalions of the 2nd Oregon Volunteers, under Colonel Summers the next day on the Quang Hoi to the Commanding General on the Newport, as an escort on his entrance into Manila. At the hour named, I reported etc. As soon as Spanish honor was satisfied, up went the white flag and General Merritt was duly escorted ashore and into the city, where he received the surrender of the Spanish general." In the Civil War, General Merritt had received 6 successive promotions for gallantry, at Gettysburg, Yellow Tavern, Five Forks, etc., and had been with Sheridan at Winchester. So the way he commanded the assault on Manila is proof only of the obligations we then owed the Filipinos. They had left very little to be done. In his account of General Merritt's original personal disembarkation at Cavite, Mr. Frank Millet acquaints his readers with a Philippine custom we afterwards grew quite familiar with and found quite useful, of keeping your shoes dry and landing from a rowboat on a beach by riding astride the shoulders of some husky native boatman. The boatmen make it a point of special pride not to let their passengers get their feet wet. Mr. Millet tells us that a general in uniform looks neither dignified nor picturesque under such circumstances, and that therefore he will not elaborate on the picture, but that it is suggestive, more of the hilarious than of the heroic. Presumably when General Merritt went ashore on August 13th, from the dispatch boat from which he had been watching the assault on Manila, to receive the surrender of the Spanish general, he followed the same custom of the country he had used on the occasion of his original disembarkation. So that in the taking of Manila, we were probably literally, as well as ethically, like General Mahone of Virginia as he is pictured in a familiar post-bellum Negro story, according to which the general met a Negro on a steep part of the road to heaven, told him that St. Peter would only admit mounted parties, mounted the Negro with the latter's consent, rode on his back the rest of the toilsome journey to the heavenly gate, dismounted, knocked, and was cordially welcomed by the saint at the sacred portal thus: "Why how ye do, General Mahone? Jest tie yo hoss and come in."